Ladies and gentlemen, as this protest goes on, there's a lot of resentment coming from the cops, and more scuffles are happening, and some of them are getting suspended and losing their jobs altogether because of the way they are handling the public. So, this came out on NPR. Policing is an avatar of American racism, Marshall Project journalist says. And this came out June 10th, 2020. Here's the audio.
This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross. Why so many police are handling the protests wrong was the headline of an article earlier this month, co-written by my guest Jamel Arte. Another recent article he co-wrote was about why Minneapolis police failed to adopt reforms and remove bad officers before George Floyd's death. L'Arte is a staff writer for the Marshall Project, a nonprofit news organization that describes itself as seeking to create and sustain a sense of national urgency about the U.S. criminal justice system. It's named after Thurgood Marshall, the first African-American Supreme Court justice. L'Arte previously reported on criminal justice, race, and policing for the U.S. edition of The Guardian. He was part of the Guardian team that created an online database tracking police violence in 2015 and 2016. That project, called The Counted, revealed the number of people killed by law enforcement and told the stories of who they were and how they died. The project found the rate of death for young Black men was 5 times higher than white men of the same age. In 2015, FBI Director James Comey said, "It's unacceptable that the Washington Post and the Guardian newspaper are becoming the lead source of information about violent encounters between U.S. police and civilians." In 2016, the National Association of Black Journalists named L'Arte the Michael J. Feeney Emerging Journalist of the Year. Jamel Arte, welcome to Fresh Air. So I wanted to ask you about an article that you co-wrote that was published on June 1st, and this was after peaceful protests in several cities were capped with, looting and some arson and confrontations with police. And it was hard to tell sometimes, like, were these the protesters? Were these just like opportunists using the protests as an excuse to loot? But you wrote an article about research that shows how crowds of protesters and crowds of police behave and what happens when the two interact, and how disproportionate police force can make a peaceful protest not so peaceful. What are some of the things that you've learned by studying the research about how police can escalate the situation through tough tactics?
So I want to start with what you mentioned about that there were these kind of different waves happening, or these different moments in protest where we didn't know if it was opportunists or it was I think it is important to think to keep in mind that to the extent that there's been destructive acts of protests, looting, that there's a range of causes, right? Are there passionate, angry people who were lashing out in grief and frustration? Yes. Are there anti-capitalists who see looting and destruction as a form of revolutionary praxis and are using this as an opportunity? Yes. Are there pure opportunists who want to get free stuff and are taking advantage of the chaos? Definitely. Are there chaos agents who are trying to give the protesters a bad name and potentially seed violence against them? It appears that was the case as well. So, I think it's really important that when we are trying to analyze these moments, that we're not reductive about socioeconomic phenomena like destructive protest or looting. And the other thing I'll say is that I think there's an important distinction between measuring the efficacy of violent protests or destructive protests versus the morality of it. The morality of it is going to be personal and subjective. Most of us can think of moments and places where we find violence or destruction useful and justified, and moments where we don't. Now, the efficacy of it is something that we can probably wrap our heads around. But again, it's complicated. If the point is to get attention, then destruction works. If the point is to win hearts and minds and the political center, then it probably doesn't. And if holding public officials hostage and forcing them to appease your demands is the point, it might depend on the public official. And so, to kind of step back from all that for a minute, I think something that you'll hear a lot, and I've heard a lot in the recent days, is that two wrongs don't make a right, which is an ethical and spiritual intuition in many traditions, but it's not a particularly American one. Our whole criminal justice system is based on the premise that two wrongs make a right. Caging humans and fining poor people money they don't have are morally wrong, but it's how we define justice in most cases in this country. But to go to your specific question about the research on de-escalating tense situations, there's research from as early as the 1967 Kerner Commission, which was, of course, this landmark federal effort to investigate urban unrest that was occurring in places like Watts and Detroit. And social scientists found that these abrasive policing actions can be really pivotal in turning peaceful demonstrations towards violence or destruction. And they recommended that police eliminate those tactics and cities establish fair ways for citizens to address their complaints against the police.
What were some of the tactics that were singled out as escalating violence instead of preventing it?
Yeah, so those will be things like clearing streets, right? Declaring a protest illegal and telling everyone that they need to move on, and kind of setting up this, I don't know if they describe it as a phalanx, right? But when all of the officers line up along the street with their riot gear and basically just start pushing people out. Some of the kettling tactics that are used to make mass arrests. Even just what officers are wearing, right? Like, are they showing up to a peaceful protest in full riot gear with batons and with weapons used to fire chemical munitions into the crowd, or are they showing up looking like peace officers? All of that contributes to how crowds interpret what the police are there for.
Yeah, and you're right that research shows if police go one step higher, so will the protesters.
That's right. In a lot of ways, I think the logic behind escalation and de-escalation, you don't necessarily need a study to understand how that works, right? Most of us recognize in our own life that escalation brings escalation, right? If you approach a situation in the most aggressive way that you can think to approach it, that often elicits an aggressive or defensive response from the person that you're dealing with. So, I mean, the research is interesting and useful, and departments should be taking stock of it. But you don't actually need a study to tell you that approaching people aggressively can lead to worse outcomes than approaching them with humanity.
You know what I think is really interesting? After the police moved in on protesters in Washington, D.C. on Monday, June 1st, and they used tear gas and pepper spray and smoke. And this was the night of the evening of Trump's now famous Bible photo op. We've seen so many just huge, massive, peaceful protests since then. I mean, the reactions seem to be almost like doubling down on peaceful protests.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think again, there was also there's tactical adjustments that are happening in the moment, right? If there's a recognition that the destruction is creating a bad narrative, then I think organizers are redoubling their efforts to make sure that everyone, as much as possible, everyone who's at protests, is sticking to a message and sticking to a script. I think there's also a degree to which the bad actors or the disingenuous actors are getting bored, and they're just not showing up to protests looking to sow chaos in the ways that they were. But the committed movement folks, who were doing this work before George Floyd, those are the ones who are continuing to plan rallies and continuing to make sure that they are having the effect that they're looking for.
You write about how in the 80s and 90s there was something called the negotiated management model of protest. What was that?
So the negotiated management model of protest is this idea that community thought leaders would be meeting with police ahead of a protest. They'd say, here's what we're going to protest. Here's when and where and how. This is how we expect it all to go down. And they'd come up with a plan to essentially let people exercise their First Amendment rights in the fullest way possible. And there would be this expectation on both sides that the police would stick to the plan that they agreed to, that the protesters would stick to the plan that they agreed to. This took a lot of the uncertainty and mistrust out of the calculation, and allowed people to express themselves. But I think one of the things that I think about in this question of pre-organizing protests is that was in a moment where it was very clear who community thought leaders were, and in many respects, they were folks who were connected to the establishment, right? I mean, in the retired law enforcement voices who I spoke to about using this approach in the 1980s and 1990s, kind of over and over again, said church leaders, people in the church, the spiritual religious leaders. Now, that's not necessarily the folks who are leading Black Lives Matter protests today. Some of them are, some of them aren't. So I think there's a lot of reasons why that model has fallen out of favor. I think it largely has to do with the militarization of U.S. police. It largely has to do with just a changing cultural attitude about how police approach their job. But it also has to do with the fact that I think ideologically and structurally, in many ways, the police and the folks who are protesting are kind of further away from one another within the society, whereas before they were sort of both members of an establishment in a community.
And if the subject of your protest is the police, it's probably a little hard to negotiate with them what the protest is going to be like.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think there's a degree to which today police appear to see themselves as counter-protesters, and I don't think that was richly addressed in the early literature on this question. I think it's ripe for more study today. The police were not disinterested parties in the people's grievances then or now, and it's foolish to pretend or to pretend that they were. But based on the historical materials that I'm aware of, they certainly seem to do a better job of pretending that they were disinterested before, whereas it increasingly today feels like in many departments, officers take these protests as a personal affront and feel inclined to respond to them.
Are there any examples or any models that you've found for how police can deal with really large protests without escalating the tension and without hurting the people, without tear gassing people and clubbing them? I mean, we've seen some really appalling examples of policing, especially during the earlier part of the protests.
Yeah, so in reporting the story, I spoke to David Cooper, who I see as in many ways the forefather of this kind of softer approach to policing protests, and this notion of the quote unquote Madison model is named after him, from his time as being police chief in Madison, Wisconsin, through the 1970s and 80s. And what he described to me is, you show up in regular uniforms. People can see your face. This was obviously outside the context of a pandemic. Your officers, you listen, you relate, you talk to people about their grievance. And in exchange for asking officers to make themselves fairly vulnerable in this way, you have these more well-equipped cops waiting somewhere close by in case things go bad. But David Cooper, when I talked to him, he said, I remember it because he said it like 5 times. He said, you never, 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 never start with the show of force and power because it ratchets up everyone's expectations for violence and can serve to generate it. And again, I mean, just when we think about escalation and de-escalation, that makes sense. You show up with the most aggressive version of how you can respond to something, and it ratchets up the perception of everyone who's there, of where this is going to go.
You point out that the police need to establish trust and good relations before the protests. And if they haven't, then it's kind of too late by the time the protests start, because there's so much anger and so much distrust.
Yeah, that's right. That was one of the kind of caveats to this research that law enforcement officials and former police chiefs told me over and over again was, just showing up in soft uniforms to a protest full of angry people does not in and of itself guarantee a peaceful, satisfactory resolution, right? The work starts before that. There needs to be some baseline level of trust between police and between a community, that they're going to do what they said they were going to do, that they're going to, right, if you're talking about one of these pre-negotiated plans for a protest, that they're going to abide by that. There's this metaphorical bank of trust between police and a community, and too often it's overdrawn in both directions, and there's no way to really approach it as anything but a war. I mean, as one of the retired law enforcement folks I spoke to said, the time to make friends is before you need them.
I think there's so much anger and frustration because of years and years and years of racism within police departments and disproportionate numbers of Black men and women killed during arrest or while in police custody, years of protests, years of promised reforms, and we're still seeing the same kinds of problems. So let's look at an example. Let's look at Minneapolis. There were promised reforms before George Floyd's death, and still George Floyd died with an officer's knee on his neck. What were some of the reforms that were promised or that were actually supposed to be initiated, and what led to those reforms?
Just to take a step back, Malcolm X once said, "You can't legislate goodwill," and I think it's maybe one of the most astute political observations of our time. And I can take the liberty of elaborating on it. I'd say you can't regulate goodwill or implement it with a consent decree or a strategic policy initiative either. So yes, we can outline specific line level reforms that were promised and not implemented, or implemented unevenly or ineffectively. Like, let's take neck restraints, for example. Many departments have chosen to ban those outright. But when the Minneapolis Police Department addressed them in 2014, they chose to leave this carve out where if deadly force was permissible, then so too was this kind of restraint. And it maybe makes sense that if you're legally justified to pull out your gun and shoot someone, you're also justified to choke them. I mean, that's the argument that's typically made, and a lot of use of force policies make it. But by leaving that carve out, there's a significant ambiguity there in the policy. You're asking officers sort of in the heat of the moment, or in the heat of several moments, to make a distinction about whether or not this particular situation merits or makes it reasonable to restrain someone's neck in that way. But putting aside that specific example, a lot of changes were made. The Minneapolis Department adopted a slew of changes after this voluntary review in 2013 by the U.S. Department of Justice. And they automated their system for flagging problem officers, as the Department of Justice recommended. They rewrote their use of force policy with a focus on the quote-unquote sanctity of life. They required officers to intervene when a fellow cop became abusive in front of them. And all of those would seem to be measures that would have lessened the possibility that an incident like what happened to George Floyd would happen. But they didn't. And so I think that's going to beg some really tough questions moving forward for reformers about why not.
So that says a lot. So they already had policies in place for cops to intervene if officers went too far and were abusive to a citizen. But you saw there were 3 other officers there and not one intervened, not one. And ladies and gentlemen, I just found out Thomas Lane one of the officers that was there when George Floyd was murdered, has been released on bond. So one is out and 3 are still in there. But y'all, please tell me what you think. I don't think you can do anything as long as you got the same corrupt cops in place. You got to get rid of these cops that are no good. Please leave your comment and subscribe. Don't forget to hit on the notification bell, and I'll see you on the next video. Peace, family.